an area where the mindset has stopped evolving in too many ways. And I really find the demographic dividend of youth in Africa, of Latin America, and India and parts of Asia as something we've got to capitalize upon, and also start to use that momentum and your responses to stop the mindset that says, well, it can't be done. And I can't think of a better example than that snail story, taking a traditional industry, rebranding, refocusing, and having a go. So, and if we're to pat ourselves on the back as a globe, you start seeing that if we take 100 people from 1800 to 2020, we will see that extreme poverty is down, basic education is up, literacy is up, democracy up. I think that is worth questioning. Vaccination up, and child mortality, which has got to be one of the biggest indicators we've got, is mercifully down. And then all of that contentment hits us with a series of black swans. What's the collective noun for black swan? A friend of mine in Oxford called it Armageddon. A black swan, a great book, by the way, written a few years ago, describes an event that takes us by surprise. But actually, it's quite funny. You'll recognize this from politicians. A black swan comes onto the scene, and then, after the event, of course, the politicians say, well, we knew it was coming. Of course, they didn't at all. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a black swan. But what is very shocking about this image is it's a collision of images. We've got COVID hit us like a wrecking ball, the like of which hasn't been seen in a long, long time. The top right-hand corner is Germany. This is not a developed world monsoon. That is Germany. Bottom left, this is Australia, where we had fires. And on the right-hand side, we've got an image from Pakistan. These are the kind of things, when you're putting together a value chain that add to things like inflationary pressures to make the world rather more complicated and ask serious questions about resilience. Because COVID exposed our resilience. It disrupted trade. And one of the key points I raise with this is often people in the developing world don't necessarily see the connections with some of these global events. I think at the moment we're seeing far more global events with greater impact in the developing world than I've ever witnessed. So for example, the fact that we have a COVID dislocation in Britain, for example, or across Europe, which means that a lot of people can't go to work. It means the bars, the restaurants, whatever, simply aren't open. Well, I come from the north of England, where an awful lot of students from India, from Africa, and so on, they come to study, but a vital part of their world is they work in a bar in the evenings to raise money. Well, what happens when you've gone for a scholarship in the developed world and all of the bars and all the restaurants and all of the part-time work that you would require is closed? Well, here's another dimension. Remittances are 5 times bigger. That is, money sent home from people working away, and this has been going on for generations, but money sent home comes from what you earn in those jobs. And if you can't earn in those jobs, remittances fall. And so, for example, the state of Kerala in India is really finding that very, very difficult indeed. And then on top of all of that, in the developed world, increasingly, we're hearing politicians say, we must spend the money at home. We must stop aid. This is now a populist theme you hear everywhere. So a lot more people are questioning globalization, and a heck of a lot more people now need to change the mindset because without an entrepreneurial ecosystem, we'll struggle. And then along came this. A little ship gets blocked in Suez. Many of you, I hope, will be familiar with this. But when this ship actually came across the Suez Canal and blocked the Suez Canal, global trade stalled. Every single day it was trapped. $9.8 billion was trapped with it. This is an incredible thing. Now, a lot of people just dismiss this as an accident and it'll all be okay very soon. And the reason why I think that that is simply incorrect is because the way we see supply chains, the way we see value chains, has for a long time been expressed by a Japanese expression, just in time. Now, just in time means you've got to line up all of your deliveries exactly. Well, when you start getting these kind of events, when you start getting COVID, when you start getting climate change, when you start getting all of those Armageddon of swans that I mentioned earlier, you cannot operate a supply chain as we have done over the last few generations. And of course, how does this translate? This translates into unemployment, and very tragically, unemployment for youth. Now, I know in this room there's a lot of talk about what am I going to do after I graduate, and I think our chair has given a few graphic illustrations of, frankly, people who have impressed everybody, and hopefully their example can spur us on. I lived for 13 years in Madrid, 2 years in Barcelona. I much prefer Football Club Barcelona, by the way. I absolutely loathe Real Madrid, but who am I to be prejudiced? Anyway, the reason I raise Spain is because maybe you need reminding that the unemployment of youth in Spain is 54%. That's apparently the developed world. And increasingly in my country, youth are forced on what is called zero-hour contracts. That's not a lifelong career. That is simply a job in a bar or a job at anywhere in the economy where you are not given any pension, you are not given anything. You are basically on the canopy walk without the wires at either side. You are literally contracted, and you can be hired and fired at will. So, you know, it's not really good news, is it? I'm saying that all of the youth of the world are actually, incredibly, in the same boat. It isn't unusual anymore, because if you start getting 54% unemployment in Spain, and you start getting underemployment and informal, I thought the informal economy, I keep being told, is, oh, that only happens in the developed world. This is ridiculous. We're having a growing informal economy in the developed world. So, you know, we've got some problems. Now, an economics concept that I have always considered really useful to express what I've just said. Bear with me, it's a big word. If you like Scrabble, you might actually use it one day. And it's hysteresis. Now, hysteresis during the 1930s in Britain, when there was massive unemployment, the Pilgrims Trust wrote a paper. And in that paper, they said the unemployed cannot be put into cold storage and taken out when they are needed. What that meant was, imagine this, take an elastic band and stretch it and stretch it and stretch it, and then let it go back together again. Do it again and let it go back together again. After you do that too often, the problem with the rubber band is it snaps. And hysteresis is a real threat with all of the learning you take away from a university. If you just simply graduate to be unemployed, then hysteresis is your destiny. not a changed mindset. So have you ever had anybody tell you that if you're not careful and you're not entrepreneurial enough, you could be a rubber band? I hope you are the rubber band that bounces back. So, we're hearing an awful lot these days about 2050. Now, tends to be that in Africa we call it 2063, and in Ghana we call it 2057, and in China we call it 2049. That's the centenary of the Chinese Revolution. But you get the idea. Somewhere around 2050, we are trying to envision the world that we will all live in. I actually think it's a really simple definition of strategy. You know, there'll be library sections here of that very complicated word, strategy. I think strategy is dead simple. It's imagine a future environment. Let's all imagine where we'll be in 2050. Will we be in Ghana? What will we be doing for Ghana? And then strategy is mapping the best way to get there. Well, I want to contest the fundamentals before we get into value stream stuff later on. I don't like calling it value chain because I feel that chain, particularly in a place like this, has horrific connotations. So I much prefer value stream, but that's for this afternoon. Let's really unpack value, or in other words, I want profit. I want the Ferrari. I want the wonderful watch. Or values. And this is really what I want to set out and look at the clash. Now, many of you in this room probably haven't done any economics. Don't worry. I'm going to try and give you far simpler elements of economics to grasp. But I think at the root of all of this debate is the word market. Now, I've seen some wonderful markets here, and markets in Africa are a good enough place to start, because whatever happens with a market, it's always boiling down to one thing. Buyers meet sellers. That's it. Now, Marx and others many years ago really questioned markets and felt that they really didn't distribute things for people very well. And in 1776, in fact, Adam Smith, who was born on the opposite side to St. Andrews, not very far from St. Andrews, sorry, in Kirkcaldy, and he was effectively the father of economics, was talking about the real root of economics is the benevolence of me will just trickle down for others. And a lot of people have taken this very literally and feel that the market will deal with everything and profit is the only motive for doing things. Now, fast forward to the First World War, when literally the whole world was involved and a lot of Africans died in this. But what did it all add up to? It meant that the world economy absolutely collapsed. And the leaders of the world economy at that time, the British, the French, the Germans, all of the European powers, literally collapsed. They went bankrupt. The beneficiary was actually the US of A. So how do you get out of a crisis when you've got no cash? Well, along comes a guy called Keynes, and he says, well, you do not stop the flow of money, you put money into the economy. And so Keynes said, what we've got to do is literally invest. The difficulty, said Keynes, and it plays to your phrase about mindset, it doesn't lie in new ideas, it lies in escaping from the old ones. Now, what happened then was we had in the 30s, after the war, it got worse, and we had a massive crash. And then what happened was a whole series of movements, including in the Second World War, tackle this by investing in Europe. So basically, a little bit like Ukraine today, and we're going to face the same problem in Ukraine very soon, whole cities were just razed to the ground. and we're seeing that on our television screens every night. Why is Ukraine important? Why is it not as important as Yemen and all of those other conflict zones? Well, there's a particular reason, and that is that, and it's a reason which brings you into this debate in Ghana, because Ukraine, as I'll come on to this afternoon, is a massive, massive producer of grain, vegetables, and so on. And it's all gone for the foreseeable future. So Ghana has a real opportunity. So there now is a clash between values and value. And these three books were very much the pivots in which these guys said, look, we don't want to go down the track of a lot of spending by government. And the guy on the right, Milton Friedman, actually was asked a question on a TV program, and he said, the question was, what is a business for? And he didn't even hesitate. He said, only to make money for shareholders. And the guy said, well, what about the rest of people, stakeholders and everything? He said, no, just for shareholders. And that was the real opener that we have to consider. And at the same time, this word entrepreneur arrives on the scene. And it's, this is my summary of a very thick book. So Schumpeter wrote this book, Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, in three basic concepts. He talks about creative destruction, new ideas, breaking through and destroying the old ones. He talks about business cycles, you know, a boom and then it falls, but it'll always come back again. And he speaks of the way this happens is innovation. All you need to do is plug in the new idea and all will be well. The business cycle will correct and away we go. But the central figure, the revolutionary of innovation, the figure, the Che Guevara, if you like, of the whole piece is the entrepreneur. This is the core concept. Now, the guys I've just talked about had a very good idea, and that was what they would do is reduce the state and up the market, and this is what happened. They ended up sending in the Americans to Guatemala, and you end up with this one, the banana republics. They were sourcing bananas at very low prices, and it's probably quite symbolic that their logos, I'm a student of branding and logos, I really like the way they're done. And in this case, the United Fruit Company chose a gun as their logo. And that, by the way, isn't symbolic. That's actually what they were using. Now, what I'm trying to put across is that those big brands in the developed world, and I speak with authority on this because I'm from the developed world, were very clearly putting the price in the top right-hand corner for retail, but right down at the bottom is the story of 4% on plant maintenance, 7% on plant and packaging. Basically, simply not enough to invest in the future. Just enough to provide better quality products, cheaper, and ever faster to the markets in the developed world where added value could happen. Added value was never in the scheme in the developing world. And then, of course, we had this Cold War, the Cuban crisis, 1962, the rest of it, and then a chap that you know better than anybody, and that stamp on the right-hand side caused all sorts of trouble because the Americans didn't like his face on a Soviet stamp. That was a red rag to a bull. But this whole idea was really raising the flag and saying, look, we need to be careful. You guys know a lot more about this than I do, but I'm translating it into the terms of value versus value in saying that the voice of the developing world needs to be heard. And neoliberalism is the curious dogma that really has gone behind the scenes in many respects. But neoliberalism is reduce the involvement of the state. Some of you in this room will say, well, that would reduce corruption. But the reality is you still need infrastructure and you still need enabling frameworks, because you can't set up a business with the snails and you can't afford to correct the roads as well. So there is a place for infrastructure, for broadband, for all of the enabling factors to be dealt with by effective and efficient policy. And that gives the entrepreneur the real opportunity to make things happen. But neoliberalism says, no, 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 no. We want no involvement by the state, everything to be privatized. Now, I'm fast forwarding here, but their laboratory was a country called Chile. And when I was at Oxford, I was actually there with a few guys from Chile. And they were quite funny, actually, because half of them were very pro-Pinochet. They'd all studied at Chicago. They all believed in this, get rid of the state completely, all that enabling nonsense, forget it. We don't need that because we'll source from the developing world. And I said, well, what's going to happen with the developing world? Well, it'll all trickle down and, everybody will benefit in the end. Nobody ever said when the end was. And so we ended up with all of these kind of things, the paradox of plenty. And then a book that I think is quite fascinating, that was suppressed, actually, very quickly, was written by a guy called Willy Brandt. Willy Brandt was the Chancellor of Germany, and he thought, look, after the Second World War, the Americans flooded Europe with money to rebuild. Flooded Europe with money to rebuild. He argued that what we need to be doing is doing the exact same thing with the developing world. So, for example, Africa, he recommended back in 1980 a $4 billion US fund, which is a lot of money, by the way, back then, to actually produce the enabling technologies for Africa to move. And then, of course, in 1989, the Berlin Wall collapses, Soviet Union is over, and the neoliberals really thought that they had won. And this is the Washington Consensus. So their view, in simple terms, was that we want structural change, and that means free markets, let the developed and developing world combine, and that means that we'll stabilize your economy, we'll privatize everything that's been in the hands of the state, we'll liberalize. Oh, and by the way, if you don't allow us to do it, we don't send you the money. And oh, and by the way, stop complaining, because that's just not going to help anything. And then, oh, and by the way, what that could mean, no, will mean, is added value will be where people can do it and you just get it out the ground. That's it. And that's more or less what was happening with the Washington Consensus. Now, I've used the term market a lot, so I want at this point to tell a joke. Question: how many market fundamentalists does it take to change a light bulb? You know the mindsets you were talking about earlier, Chair? Well, the answer to that is none. Because if the light bulb needed changing, the market would have done it. So, what happened to the developing world in all of this debate? Well, there's three books that are quite interesting. First, Banker to the Poor. This guy, Muhammad Yunus, became the patron saint of what we should be doing in the developing world. And this is microfinance. I have to say that I think this is one of the worst policies that I have ever seen anywhere on the planet. It's a policy whereby you would see, to sum up, that I give a loan to that woman in the photograph to buy that sewing machine. But that doesn't mean anything, because what we want is the money for a room full of sewing machines. We want to invest in an industrial push We don't want to just fritter around at the edges. Feel-good factor, give you a loan, give you a loan, give you a loan, give everybody in the room a loan, and off you go. With no mentoring, no nothing. And in India, where I've done an awful lot of work, I've been in villages where every single member of that village has a microfinance loan, and I could tell you that over a third of them went into weddings, another third went into dowries, and not an awful lot went into investing in what was going on. Now, there's another book that the West often points to, and this is Hernando de Soto, The Mystery of Capital. Now, I think in this there is a part of the truth that we've got to start thinking about. Basically, in the UK, where I live, I own a house, and I have the deeds to the house capital. I need a sum of money to get going. I've got this business case for snails, and I've got this cash flow requirement, so I've got this house, I can borrow the money, I can get going, and so on. So actually, you have to go into greater debt, and you have often to trade equity quicker than you should, because the governments of your countries, I'm not just talking about Ghana, I'm talking about everywhere, have simply failed to get this one solved. And this is a very serious issue. And then the future, the fortune at the bottom of the pyramid. I was working in India a hell of a lot when this came out, and I worked for the Confederation of Indian Industry. This guy was a hero. And I kind of read it, and it's a good idea, and there's a lot of things that he's saying, where he's saying, you know, there's a pyramid, and we've got the poor, the very, very poor at the bottom, and it goes up to this. But I disagree. Demographically, that's not what it is. Imagine a diamond, and the diamond has a middle, and the middle classes do exist. And then the middle classes are in the middle of the diamond, the very poor are at the bottom, and the very, very rich are right at the top. So I don't get this, actually, at all, because I think it misleads. It does something worse, because it's really the manifesto of telling the developed world there is a fortune to be made in the developing world. So off you go and have a look around, and there's easy pickings, and there's low-hanging fruit. Well, I think the low-hanging fruit's in your hands. That's what I think. And I think that these three books, they sound as if they are sympathetic to the developing world, but if you really get behind and unpack the values versus value, they're really supporting the view that what we're really about is make a load of cash and it'll all trickle down. We'll make a load of cash, and I've not seen too many people giving it away with gay abandon. They just don't. So we need to be careful. But there were other people with very clever ideas, and this is Small is Beautiful, a study of economics as if people mattered. Very important. Now, when I was at Oxford, I was on a staircase, which is a very Oxford expression, nice little beautiful old quadrangle, and I was on a staircase, and I had my study, and the guy above me was this guy, Amartya Sen. And I, to my absolute shame, would nod at this guy as he went up and down the staircase. And that's about it.